Legendary football coach Vince Lombardi is famous for entering into his team's locker room at the beginning of the training season and uttering these words, "Gentlemen, this is a football." The point he was trying to make was that if they were going to be a successful football team, they needed to start with and master the fundamentals, the irreducible minimums. For decades, people have looked to this principle to find success in business, in personal goals, and a host of other objectives. But is there a similar principle that could be applied to a person whose goal is to become Christ-like in everything they do? And shouldn't one of the purposes of the church be to help people figure out how to do this? Let's chat about it. Welcome to Clear Creek Chat. That's Chat with two T's because this podcast is coming to you from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and is a ministry of the Clear Creek Church of Christ. In each episode, we gather together a couple of our friends to have a conversation about issues that touch our lives locally and have a broader implication for the kingdom of God. My name is Mitchell Halstead, and today I'm once again joined by my buddy and our church's adult discipleship minister, Evan Aldridge.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir. So this week, really the next couple of weeks, some big things are happening. Today actually is Inauguration Day for those that will listen to this in a couple days later. So that's kind of a big deal. We're all hoping everything goes well and there's no insanity that ensues. But maybe more relevant to me and you is the fact that we're getting close to the Super Bowl.
And far more important.
Some would say. So any predictions? At the point of this recording, we have not yet hit the conference championships.
Right.
So we got 4 teams left.
I don't know. I guess to channel my inner Vince Lombardi, I think I'm going to go with the Packers. It's tough to bet against the way Aaron Rodgers is playing right now. So that is just my personal prediction. As long as Tom Brady doesn't ever win another Super Bowl, I'll be a happy man.
Now this goes back to the old battle grounds around this place, around southern United States, of just hating Tom Brady just for the sake of hating him.
No, we hate Tom Brady because he thinks he's better than Peyton Manning.
That's what it is.
That's the issue.
The legend Peyton Manning from University of Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Even though they're like really good friends in real life, I just pretend that is not real. So,
well, I have to confess, I am sort of a closet Brady fan, just because he's arguably the best, and I like to see the best just keep winning. I'm weird. I'm like anti-underdog in some ways. We'll see what happens. Who knows? We'll get there eventually.
Maybe. All right.
So to the point here. If you hang around Clear Creek Church long enough, or hopefully any church, you're likely to hear the words like discipleship or personal spiritual growth. In fact, if you are able to see behind me, several of these books have words like growth on them. And if you dug through them, you would see these concepts over and over and over again. And certainly within our church context, you would hear these words spoken by our preacher, or maybe during a training session if you're a leader of some kind, or maybe even one from one of our wonderful adult volunteers. Mm-hmm. These are the kind of concepts we're constantly trying to promote: being a disciple, growing spiritually. Now, obviously, these concepts are found throughout the biblical narrative. You're going to see them in Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament. And you don't necessarily need this podcast to explain to you why it's important to grow spiritually.
Right.
Nevertheless, being a disciple is actually quite hard. I think any of us that have been doing it for a while recognize that it's not just a simple thing to do. And who doesn't like a little bit of help along the way?
I like a lot of help.
I like a lot of help.
When you think about the idea that you are trying to pattern your life after the one person who was perfect, that can be a little daunting. I mean,
yes, it seems a little unfair in some ways, but that's our goal. Our goal is to be like Christ. So that's why we brought you in, Evan, to help give us all the answers on the correct way. I'm just kidding. That's not how it works. But he is here to help us have a conversation about how we can bring the idea of this is a football mentality, the irreducible minimums, the fundamentals of the Christian faith, bring those into the conversation of helping people take their next steps on their spiritual journey. So I know in several podcasts, we've talked about the word disciple, what it is to be one. Let's just go ahead and define that, because our church does sort of have an adopted definition of this.
Yeah, and I will read it so that I don't mess it up. Disciple, it is someone who is following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and is committed to the mission of Jesus.
So whenever you hear the word disciple used by one of our ministers, or in the context of an environment like this podcast, that's really what we mean, is that definition right there. Now, we also talk about this idea of a disciple being on a path of spiritual growth, discipleship path, you might say. And actually, that's really the first topic of our conversation here today. So I want to ask you, Evan, can you help to explain what is a discipleship path?
Yeah, and that's not a term that's new to us.
Sure.
Many churches have a discipleship path, and the way that we want to use it, and the way that most churches use it, is the discipleship path is basically just the things you do to try to live like Jesus. And so we take the life of Jesus, we look at the core of who he was, of what he did, and we take those few things and try to model our lives after that.
Now, can't you just like bumble around blindly and figure this out on your own?
Yes.
That's maybe not the most efficient way to do it.
No, and to be honest, in some ways, we may have been doing that for a long time. Not our church specifically, but just churches around the world. It's been a really neat movement as churches are declining in America. There has been this huge resurgence of getting back to what did Jesus do in his life, and let's look at it, because we know that is the one thing that's infallible, the things that he did in his life. And so it's been pretty cool to see churches really across the world be able to really get back to the basics.
Yeah, and the intentionality behind it is so wonderful. I think back to like Vince Lombardi and a football team. If you're trying to get your team to win a football game or just learn how to play the game, you don't just send them out on the field and let them run around for an hour and a half.
Right.
That they might pick up some skills on how you run, but it's about it. No, if you're a coach, you train them intentionally to better their skills. And that's kind of the idea behind what we're wanting to do,
right,
is help people understand that there are some intentional things you can do to become more Christ-like. Right. So why, and I kind of answered it already, but why do we need something that is at least slightly formalized in the sense of a discipleship path?
I think one of the biggest reasons, we're really good at making things complex, just humans in general. And so anytime we can make something simple, we want to be able to do that. That's why Apple went crazy and is still going crazy for years. They're so user-friendly, the simplicity of opening up your phone and clicking on an app. It's simple, but it removes barriers. Like especially for people who don't know Jesus, we want to make sure that we are making it as easy as possible for them to follow Jesus. And so when they walk into our church building, we want to be able to say, hey, when we look at the life of Christ, here are the X number of things that he did. So here's what we're going to try to do.
We just want to strip away the complexity, as you said, and try to give them the irreducible minimums of this is what Christ did, this is what he looked like. I guess that's also really helpful if you are a disciple maker.
For sure.
So if you're just average Joe Christian and you want to be a disciple maker, which would make you far from average, I would argue. But if somebody says to you at your job or, on your rec team or whatever it is you do, hey, I know you're a Christian. I'd like to know, tell me more about Jesus. Like, who was this guy? What did he do? I suppose if you could point back to something that was a simplified, example of here are some of the things that I know to be true of the behavior and character of Christ, that would be an easy thing for you to just use as a tool for discipling somebody else. You could answer the question, what do you do to follow Jesus? If you had a simplified version of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pretty useful.
One thing you did say, though, that kind of caught me was you wouldn't be considered an average Christian if you were making disciples. And I think,
unfortunately.
But I think that's the pedestal that we have put things like following Jesus and helping others follow Jesus on, when in reality, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the second we start following Jesus, we can start making disciples. If you look at Andrew, right? He was following Jesus for 0.7 seconds?
Yeah, half a second.
And then he went to what?
He went to find his brother.
And that began a discipling relationship with his brother. As Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. And so that's a big part of the path, is that the second you're on that path, you are able to engage with everything that Jesus did. Maybe not to the best of your ability or the way that he did them exactly, but we can begin that process with everybody. So that's just a sidebar.
Yeah, I think that's great. Point. We've been reading on staff a couple of different books about disciple making cultures, and I remember there was a part in one of those books where they were talking about how if you are one who has been discipled by an effective disciple maker, so you have come to Christ by someone who has gone out of their way to share with you what it looks like to be a Christian, then that's all you really know. Like, that's what you assume Christians do. And so you are primed to immediately turn around
Right.
and go try to make a disciple. And it's a pretty cool thing. And we were joking earlier about the Mandalorian TV show and how whenever somebody like challenges the main character on one of the principles that he lives by, he can answer, well, this is the way. This is the
Right.
way. And what if that's what we all thought in the spiritual sense of, am I supposed to be a disciple maker? And we say, well, yes, this is the way. Does it look like X, Y, and Z to follow Jesus? And you said, yeah, this is the way. And in fact, I bet you could probably reference this, right? What did the earliest Christians, what were they called?
Yeah, followers of the way.
The way. This is the way.
This is the way.
The way of Christ. All right. So part of this idea gets back to the notion of focusing on what really matters the most. So what are some of those things and what's the value in thinking that way?
Again, it strips away the barriers. It makes it as simple as possible. But I think we can accidentally spend a lot of time doing good things that may not exactly be the things that Jesus asked us to do. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a lot of time, and I don't mean that to sound, like a jerk or crass or anything, but I don't have many hours in the day, and so I would love for someone to come along and make it as simple and as maybe upfront as possible for me to know exactly the things I need to be doing to follow Jesus today, so that I don't get distracted by the stuff that may be good, but may not be exactly what a follower of Jesus needs to be doing.
Yeah. Now, I know that this idea of a discipleship path, at least in the Clear Creek context, is a bit of a work in progress. It's not ready to just be described in full, but it sounds kind of like we might be working ourselves towards a checklist, but I don't think that's what we're trying to do. So help me understand, like, how does this not turn being a disciple into a checklist of things to mark off?
Sure. So, a checklist, once you do something on that checklist, you mark it off and then you're done with it, right? You move on to the next thing. And I mean, we can turn anything into that, right? We can turn any training regimen into that in sports. You can go through every part of your day and you can make it a checklist. But the idea is when we start down this path, we're not making up things to do. We are looking at what Jesus did, and we're trying to not just do them. We're not just trying to do the things that Jesus did. We're trying to do them in the way that he did them and for the reasons that he did them. And so they were in his DNA, the things that are on this path, like they made up who he was. And so until he ceased to be who he was going to continue to do each and every one of these things.
I think that's a good point, that if we are adopting these practices as well, it's not just so that we can do the thing, it's so we can be.
Right.
So it's really an identity shift. It's not a behavioral change, although that's a huge element of it. You change your behavior, and in doing so, eventually through the power of the Holy Spirit, you are transformed in the inner being to be more like Christ. So a checklist says, all right, I did these things. Discipleship Path says, I am becoming this.
Absolutely.
And that's a significant difference.
Yeah, it's huge, and I love the way that you said that. It shifts from a do to a be. The idea of abiding and the idea of just letting that define who you are. If you think about a literal path in the woods, right? You go hiking. There are things that if you want to further yourself down that path, that you're going to have to do, right? You're going to have to move your legs. You're going to have to breathe. That's probably pretty important. You're going to have your eyes open. You're going to have to be looking around, right? And so as you're going on that path, you're doing all three of those things. Now, at some point, if you decide, I think I've taken enough breaths for today, I'm just going to stop and I'm just going to walk and I'm going to look around and make sure I don't trip on a root, you're probably not going to get very far. So the entire time that you are moving on this path, you are engaging with all of those things. You're doing all those things the whole time. Now, the further you go, the better you're probably going to get at it, right? The more you hike, the stronger your legs are going to get. You may be able to
become a better hiker.
You may take deeper breaths. You may know that, that rock is slippery and I don't want to bust my face when I fall, so I'm going to step over it. And so it's this idea that it's not that you do one of these things and stop. It's that you continue to engage in all of these things because, like you said, it's about who you are, not what you do, but it's about who you are. And the things that we want to focus on in the path help us not to just do what Jesus did, but to become more like Jesus.
Yeah, that's so great. Yeah, it reminds me of one of our members at our church, Booty Fox, right? So for decades, he's an older man. For decades, he's been a hiker. But I guarantee you, he wouldn't say that, I hike. I go on hikes. He would probably define it more in the sense of, I am a hiker, like, because he volunteers and he helps to blaze trails, or at least he used to. Like, that was part of his identity, was a person who fully embraces the activity of hiking in all of its capacities. He doesn't do it to check lists. He does it because that's who he is. And isn't that the way it should be with us as disciples? We're not just doing the practices that Jesus did. We're trying to be like him so that it becomes second nature to us. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and hit pause for the moment, and we'll come back and continue this conversation and shift it more from Discipleship Path to the growth track in part 2. So hang tight.